Audio check. Okay, everyone, it's 7 o'clock. I'll be starting the presentation in 1 minute, in case we have any stragglers that are still going to be logging on. All right, everyone, we're going to get started. I'm sure some people are going to be joining us as they get online. Just a couple of quick housekeeping items before we get started. First of all, this is a live stream, but I've disabled the comments for this presentation. Since this is the first time that I've done something like this, I wasn't sure if I could manage comments coming through live and trying to do the presentation at the same time. You can comment at the end. If you have any questions as the presentation is going on, you'll notice on the screen here I do have my email address up, and so you can send your questions to that email address, and if I get them before the end of the presentation, I can answer them at the end. Also, before we get started, you'll notice I do have some of the social media accounts up on the screen, and you can make note of them. They'll be up on the screen again at the end. And so let's get started. And so again, I'd like to welcome everybody. This is the first time that I've done something like this, and so the subject of tonight's presentation is the Gunflint and Lake Superior Railroad. The title is Gunflint Lake Superior, Ontario's Private American Railroad. And so this is kind of a very obscure and quite unique story. And so we're going to probably spend the next hour or so going through this and taking a look at some of the aspects of this and how it's become kind of this sort of very fascinating and again, obscure story from this part of North America. I guess I should start with a little bit of an introduction. And so, first of all, my name is Dave Battistel, and I've been at this for quite a long period of time. And so, in my real life, I am a teacher. I'm a history teacher in Thunder Bay, Ontario. And if you don't know where that is, that's on the north shore of Lake Superior, just north of the United States border with Minnesota. And so for the past 22 years, I've been teaching history at St. Patrick High School here in Thunder Bay. I also coach football, and I'm married, have a couple of great kids. You can see some pictures on the screen there. The middle picture is myself and my son after this year's football championship. My boys have been on a lot of the adventures that we've done together, and so they've shared some of my experiences. Now, in terms of myself, I've been at this for a very, very long period of time. And so my history with all of this dates back to the year 1990. And so that year, I was still a teenager. I made my first visit to North Lake, and I was first introduced to some of the history of the area, particularly the Port Arthur, Duluth, and Western Railway. And since that time, I have sort of had a keen interest, and 4 years later, in 1994, I began formally researching the history of the PD Railway, as it's known around here, and as well as a lot of its associated enterprises and ventures, so things like logging and silver and iron mining. And so that research has taken me many, many different places, and both in terms of museums and archives, and also in the field. I spend a lot of time out doing research. One of my favorite areas is back to that Boundary Waters area, the North Gunflint Lake area. I love spending a lot of time in, and actually three bottom pictures that you see on your screen right here are all taken in the Boundary Waters area. So again, I've been at this for a very long period of time. I've been doing presentations about some of these topics for over 20 years now. This is my first time doing this online, so it's kind of a bit of a new experience for me. I do want to send out a little bit of a shout out. I was inspired to do this presentation by the Thunder Bay Historical Museum Society and the Lakehead University Department of History. They actually last week, because of the current COVID-19 situation, started doing a series of online webinars on Wednesday evenings. And so I thought, if they can do that, why can't I? And so I decided to take some of the lectures and presentations that I do and put them online. And so obviously you're seeing one of them, and I'll talk a little bit about why I chose this one first. And so anyway, so if you have an opportunity, if you want to take in the webinars that are going on Wednesday night, you can visit the Thunder Bay Historical Museum Society on their Facebook page, and you'll get the links for that. All right, so let's get started with the presentation tonight. So the last few years, I've actually started putting this little slide into my presentation. One of the things that we tend to do sometimes is we tend to sort of pigeonhole topics, and we start to say that this history belongs here and that history belongs there, it's not necessarily the case. And so in this particular situation, we're talking about a subject that actually spans the history of two countries, and in particular two geographic territories of those countries, the state of Minnesota and the province of Ontario. And again, I do spend a lot of time in the Boundary Waters area. I spend time on both sides of the border, both in sort of that southern part of northwestern Ontario and the northern part of Cook County, Minnesota. And so the thing that I really try to emphasize is that there's no separate history. It's a shared history. And there are some differences between our two countries, and in this case, the two geographic entities, the state of Minnesota and the province of Ontario, very kind of different histories in terms of how we evolved and how we joined the particular countries that we belong to. But in this case, we share a lot of commonalities, and this story is a story that belongs in both places, in both countries, in both the state of Minnesota and the province of Ontario, because it spans and it's so intertwined with both places. Like I said, it's such a fascinating topic to take a look at. So, if you didn't have a chance to read and hear a little bit about what we're going to be talking about this evening, again, it's a very kind of unique and a very obscure story. Probably a lot of people haven't heard about it. And so what we're going to be doing is we're going to be talking a little bit about a company that was originated in Wisconsin and decided to set up its operations at the time was the city of Port Arthur, which is now part of the city of Thunder Bay. And for many, many years, this company was the largest employer in the city of Port Arthur. And people who are familiar with the company kind of know about some of their other logging operations. But this one is, again, the more obscure one. And so during the time that they were working, they incorporated and built a railroad into Minnesota to harvest timber along Gunflint Lake and some of the areas adjacent to that. And it became kind of one of the most unique railroads and logging operations in all of North America. This railroad was an American railroad, but it had no connection or terminus inside the United States. The only way to get to it was through Canada. And as far as I know, that is the only instance of a railroad like that in all of the continent. All of the logs that were cut in Minnesota were hauled back into Canada and shipped to Port Arthur, and then they were processed into lumber, and most of that lumber ended up in markets in the western part of Canada. So again, a very, very unique situation. And so what we're going to do is we're basically going to be talking a little bit about sort of the origins of this company, some of the people that were involved with it, how this particular operation along Gunflint Lake and the boundary waters began and how it played out. So some quick facts about this this company and this operation. And so the company that we're going to be talking a little bit about is the Pigeon River Lumber Company. The railroad in question, again, is called the Gunflint and Lake Superior, and it was constructed in 1902 and was used up until 1909. The railroad itself was approximately 6 miles long. The company operated 2 logging camps along the line, and they utilized 2 locomotives to haul their lumber, their logs, which would eventually be processed into lumber from their location at Gunflint Lake to where it was eventually hauled to Port Arthur to be processed. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the origins of this company. Now, again, we don't have time to get into all the intricate details. I'm going to be kind of giving you the short version of this. One of the things that I didn't mention with regard to this was, first of all, I'm actually writing a book on this particular topic, and I'll talk a little bit more about that at the end. This originally started as an article, as like an essay. There have been a few mentions of this particular operation in the past. One was in a book that was written by an author named Willis Raff, and it was the history of Cook County, Minnesota. And so he does talk a little bit about the Gunflint Lake Superior Railroad. The other mention was in a book by an author named J.P. Bertrand, and the book was called Timber Wolves, and it's basically the history of logging and lumbering in northwestern Ontario. And again, Bertrand does mention a little bit about this operation. And so when I sort of started researching it, again, it was originally supposed to be an article, but as I started finding more and more information, it kind of exploded into something that I never thought it would, and something that I never imagined I would go to in terms of writing a book on this particular type of subject. And again, so I can't get into all the background details with regard to how this all started out, but I'll try to give you the quick version of all of it. So the Pigeon River Lumber Company, again, originated out of Wisconsin. It was incorporated in year 1900, in the summer of 1900. And the 3 individuals that were responsible for creating this company were, first of all, a gentleman from a place called Grand Rapids, Wisconsin, which is now called Wisconsin Rapids. His name was Daniel J. Arpin. He was joined by a guy named Herman Finger, who was at the time the vice president and general manager of the company, and another gentleman by the name of William Scott, who was the secretary and treasurer. Now, again, this is kind of the short version. There's a whole background story to this. These gentlemen were actually started looking at timber in this particular area in the northern part of Minnesota and in northwestern Ontario going back to the year 1897. They actually traveled up to this area in the year 1898 to take a look at it, and there was a sort of a lengthy process they went through to purchase the timber, and they were at the same time actually working with another company as well called the Alger Smith Company that was out of Michigan, and they were going to kind of log concurrently along the Pigeon River. And so again, there's a whole background story that I'm kind of omitting here, but we don't have the time to get into that tonight. And so next little slide here just to show you is the a little bit of the logo and sort of the formal incorporation of the company itself. Okay, and so you can see their logo, and obviously based out of Port Arthur, Ontario. And so just to show you a couple photographs here of the principals again. And so first of all, we have DJ Arpin, Daniel J. Arpin, out of Grand Rapids. His father was originally from Quebec and immigrated to Wisconsin in the mid 1800s. Then he was joined by William Scott Jr., who was also from Grand Rapids. A lot of people in the Thunder Bay area will recognize the name. William Scott later on was a driving force in the eventual construction of a road route between what would eventually become the city of Thunder Bay and Duluth, Minnesota. and in particular the bridge across the Pigeon River that at the time was known as the Outlaw Bridge. And for many, many years, the highway, which is Highway 61 today from Thunder Bay to the border, for many, many years was known as the Scott Highway, named after William Scott. And the third original incorporator was a gentleman by the name of Herman Finger, who was originally from Milwaukee. Quite an interesting character, very large, kind of very gregarious type of character. And eventually, again, there's sort of a background story that we don't have a lot of time to get through, but they were joined by a fourth individual, a guy by the name of Frank Hixon, and he hailed from the city of La Crosse, Wisconsin. Again, very, very kind of interesting character. The Arpin family was a very prominent logging family in Wisconsin, and Hixon even more so. His father was very, very affluent, very well known, involved in a lot of ventures. Basically, Frank Hixon was probably one of the biggest loggers in the state of Wisconsin at the time, right? So, I mean, we're not just talking about some obscure individuals. We're actually talking about some, heavyweights, if you want to call them, in terms of the, the logging industry in that state. Now, what's kind of interesting is some of the personal stories that are involved, and there's kind of this very interesting kind of relationship between these three individuals. So Arpin, Scott, and Hixon. So Arpin and Scott came from the same town in Wisconsin. They came from Grand Rapids, Wisconsin, and they were actually good friends, judging by their correspondence, right? There's a very kind of seems like a very long and historic relationship between the two. Hixon was actually married to Scott's cousin, and he was also a partner in Scott's uncle's lumber business. And so there's a connection between the two of them. Arpin and Hixon were actually partners in a couple of other ventures prior to the incorporation of the Pigeon River Company. And from what I can tell, Arpin's brother, he had a number of brothers. One of his brothers was actually really good friends with Hixon. So again, there's kind of really this very intriguing relationship between the three of these individuals. So just to, as we move ahead here, just to show you, a little bit of visual here. So a little bit of letterhead here showing you the company. Some of the letterhead would have, obviously the company was technically headquartered out of Grand Rapids, Wisconsin, obviously operationally out of Port Arthur. So one of the questions we need to mention is why? So why would these individuals who were in the state of Wisconsin, why would they decide to kind of uproot themselves and come to the town of Port Arthur up in the northwestern part of Ontario and start a logging operation up here? Well, a lot of it had to do with the changing dynamics at the time in the northern U.S. states. And when you study the story, you actually kind of see it's almost like a line of dominoes. So for many, many years, the big, pine-producing state was Michigan. And then basically they logged all the pine out of Michigan, and then Wisconsin became the big kind of pine-producing state, and eventually their stands were depleted, and then things began shifting westward and northward, and so we basically had some of these individuals spreading into the state of Minnesota, and then some of them spreading up northward as well into Ontario. Now, again, there's a lot of background story to this that I can't really explain, but one of the things that was happening in Michigan for a few years was some of these loggers, once their supply of logs were depleted in Michigan, they started actually cutting logs on the southern shore of, the northern shore of Georgian Bay, the southern part of northeastern Ontario, and what they would do is they'd actually raft the logs across Georgian Bay and Lake Huron to their mills in Michigan. And eventually this caught the attention of the Ontario government, and there were some trade spats going on between Canada and the United States at the time. And so the Ontario government basically passed a law and said that any logs cut on Crown land, in Ontario, a lot of the land is owned by the government, is owned by the Crown, and they just basically said that if you cut logs on Crown land, you have to process them in Ontario. And so that basically shut off the supply of logs from Ontario. And so a lot of these loggers from Michigan and Wisconsin and Minnesota, now if they wanted to cut logs in Ontario, they actually had to set up sawmills in Ontario. And so at the time, I've kind of referred to this a little bit, but basically white pine was the most sought after species of log at the time. I mean, there was a lot of sort of characteristics that made it very marketable. And the problem is that it was being consumed at such a voracious pace that the stocks of it were being depleted very, very rapidly. And so, again, with the ones in Wisconsin disappearing, people started looking other places to try to find the supplies of these logs. And so, again, if you've never seen an eastern white pine, again, you may not have, because in many places there are not very many eastern white pine around anymore, because essentially they were all harvested at one time or another. So eventually the company was organized. Now the problem is that in order for them to set up shop in Ontario, they actually had to get permission. And so this is a copy of the Order in Council from the Lieutenant Governor of Ontario that basically gave the company the rights to do business in Ontario. And so once they got that, they could effectively set themselves up and operate. Obviously, one of the first things they had to do was be able to have a location where they could saw the lumber. And so at the same time that they were setting up their operations along the Pigeon River, they began the hunt for a sawmill, anything that they could use. And they decided to purchase a sawmill formerly owned by a company known as Graham and Horn, who had been operating in the city of Fort William, which was the adjacent city to Port Arthur at the time. And so obviously there was a lot of people very excited in the city of Fort William. Again, if you're not sort of familiar with the area, there was at the time a lot of competition, a lot of rivalry between the sister cities of Fort William and Port Arthur. And the people obviously at Fort William were very excited about this, and excited that the mill was going to be located in their town, and again for the economic opportunities, but again to kind of thumb their nose at the people of Port Arthur. And so for a number of years, the fact that they had set up shop in Fort William was reflected in their letterhead. So you can see here, the mills at Fort William, Ontario. People familiar with the area. This was the location of the Graham and Horn Mill that was purchased by the Pigeon River Lumber Company. So it was along the Kaministiquia River, close to the waterfront in Fort William. And so it was right where the Kaministiquia River splits into its first additional river, which is the Mission River, and then eventually splits in the McKellar River as well. And so this is a photograph of that mill in Fort William. And again, this mill was basically designed to be a temporary mill. They had no sort of intention of sort of permanently being anchored to the spot. And so again, the competition started over again between the two cities to see who was going to land the permanent mill, whether it was going to be in Fort William or Port Arthur. And the city of Port Arthur emerged victorious. So in July of 1901, the announcement was made that the new sawmill would be located in the city of Port Arthur. The city itself actually gave the lumber company, gave the Pigeon River Lumber Company a very big subsidy. Literally, they raised the money in an afternoon. And I'm not sort of understating this. There was like people going around to some of the prominent businessmen with a hat and like throw somebody in this hat. And they managed to basically raise about $5,000 in an afternoon to try to kind of lure the company to set up in the city of Port Arthur. And so the sawmill that they were going to build here, the construction began in the fall. And you can see in this article here talking a little bit about, the Pigeon River Lumber Company are completing the largest sawmill in Western Ontario, and this is going to be a great economic opportunity for the people of the area. This is going to be, a fantastic development. And obviously the people of the city and the businessmen are going to profit very much from this operation. So again, people familiar with the area. So this was the location of the Pigeon River Lumber Company mill, and so it was kind of just a little bit past the midway point between the two cities, along the waterfront. And again, that would facilitate them driving their logs from the Pigeon River up Lake Superior to the mill. Again, people who live in the area will be very familiar with that particular area. And so this is a photograph of the Pigeon River Lumber Company mill in 1903. Again, very, very modern mill, a very high level of mechanization. There was actually a lot less workers that were needed at the mill because a lot of the operations in the mill were automated. A lot of sort of turning levers and pulling switches and things like that to make everything happen. And this is just another shot. I believe this is the planing mill where the raw boards would have been finished. Again, the photograph taken in 1903. And so then you can see a change with regard to the letterhead. Now the mill's being located at Port Arthur, Ontario, as opposed to Fort William. Okay. So obviously the main topic of our talk tonight is talking a little bit about the Pigeon River Lumber Company logging at Gunflint Lake. And again, some of you out there might be familiar with the Pigeon River Lumber Company. You might be obviously familiar with their operations on the Pigeon River because that was their first and most lasting operation. But there was a very significant amount of activity at Gunflint Lake, and we want to talk a little bit about why they ended up there and how this operation kind of unfolded. Okay, so why Gunflint? Well, obviously, one of the big problems that we had in this area was because of geographical reasons, there were very limited stands of white pine in this particular area. There's terrain issues. As you start moving more north, you start getting into more what we call shield country, more Canadian shield geography with very rocky, very swampy type terrain, less topsoils. Okay, less rich soils. White pine doesn't like to grow in that area. They prefer kind of very moist, very deep type of soils, and that's why you tended to find a lot of white pine in places like Michigan and Wisconsin, Minnesota, the southern parts of Ontario, northeastern Ontario. Northwestern Ontario just doesn't have the right type of geography for that type of species to flourish. As well, there were a number of forest fires that kind of ripped through the area from time to time, and there were a large number of white pine stands that were consumed in those fires. And so the amount of white pine that they could harvest was limited, and Gunflint Lake just happened to have some of that white pine they could harvest. So when we take a look at this specific area, basically a lot of the white pine was in sort of isolated pockets or very specific pockets. So you found white pine along the Pigeon River, which forms the boundary between Ontario and Minnesota, and its tributaries, so north of the border along the Whitefish and Arrow rivers, and south of the border along the Stump and the Swamp rivers. You also will find white pine in places like Gunflint Lake and to the south. Now, one of the big problems they had with Gunflint Lake is actually on the other side of the height of land, on the other side of the Continental Divide. And so what was happening on Pigeon River was that the logs were being cut and basically floated down the river to Lake Superior and then dragged in booms up to their sawmill. Well, you couldn't do that because the water in Gunflint Lake actually flows north to Hudson's Bay. And so there was a bit of technical issue involved in there. Now, one of the advantages that they had was there was actually a railway line that went through that area, okay, the Port Arthur, Duluth, and Western Railway. And I'll talk a little bit about kind of how that all plays into the equation. And so one of the big reasons why they went after this Gunflint timber was because cutting on the Pigeon River, because they had to drive the logs over the river and down the river, that wouldn't happen until the springtime, until the ice melted and the rivers started to flow. So the problem was that a lot of their operations were very seasonal. They couldn't really saw, 12 months of the year, and so their operation, unfortunately, was very uneconomical. And so by going in after these logs at Gunflint, it will allow them to haul the logs during the wintertime, and so hopefully keep their sawmill open all year long. And so again, if you're not kind of familiar with the area, so basically, little map here that's essentially showing you the city of Thunder Bay, or at the time Port Arthur and Fort William, and Gunflint Lake is down here. The distance between Port Arthur and Gunflint Lake was approximately 80 miles, so it's quite a long distance. But again, there was a railway line that connected the two places. Now, just I'm a bit of a geography guy as well, so I do love my maps. And so this is a map that was published in 1899. It's a Minnesota pine forest map. And so essentially what you see here on the map is you see a few different shades of green. The darker the color green was obviously the more dense stands of pine forests in the area. The lighter color green obviously was less plentiful stands, and might be a little bit difficult to see on this slide. And the next slide you'll see a little bit of a close-up, but there is kind of a third green color, and that basically shows areas that have been in some spots burnt over by forest fires. And so when we take a look at this map again, you'll see that there is very dark green areas along the Pigeon River here, and a few spots along kind of the northern border here, and then more to the south. And so if we zoom in on that Gunflint Lake area, we see a couple of things on the map here. We can obviously see the railway line, the Port Arthur, Duluth, and Western, and then basically you can see sort of the map. Now what's interesting is that area around Gunflint Lake has that color scheme that indicates that area was burnt over. And there were forest fires that went through that area in around 1894. And so it's kind of a very interesting, story when we take a look at that they actually went into an area that maybe was kind of burnt over. So, was this map completely accurate? Obviously, they weren't going to go and set up an operation here if there weren't actually trees to harvest. Okay, so things get started. So the logging again at Gunflint Lake started in September of 1902. The timberlands in the area were actually owned by a group of individuals. The first one was a guy by the name of John Millen, who was actually the vice president of a company that they had been working with on the Pigeon River, which was the Alger Smith and Company. Russell Alger was a very, very famous Michigan lumberman. Was actually the Secretary of War in the U.S. government around the turn of the century, so very, very well-known individual. Some of the other land was owned by two guys by the name of Rupp and Kerr, who were again from Michigan. And so basically this was a really, really big monetary deal. Basically the Pigeon River Company agreed to not only buy the timber at Gunflint Lake, but they were also going to buy all the timber that Alger Smith was that had at the Pigeon River too. So this was a massive, massive deal. You can see the numbers in the article here. We're talking about pushing close to $200,000 at the time for all of the timber, and as well they were buying out all of Alger Smith's equipment and horses and everything as well too. So we're talking about quite a large exchange of money. And so that change is reflected in the Pigeon River Lumber Company as well. So this is an article a few days later from the Fort William Daily Times Journal, basically talking about how the new Pigeon River Mill is going to expand its capacity, right? Because now we have all of this new timber that we're going to be harvesting, and so they're kind of getting ramped up for this. At the same time this is all happening, the Pigeon River Company is now preparing to open up the camp at Gunflint, right? And they're talking about shipping out equipment, they're shipping out horses. Okay, so I mean things are moving ahead very, very quickly. I thought this article was very interesting, again, from the Fort William Daily Times Journal, and it's from October of 1902, and very sort of tragic article, and it talks a little bit about a French-Canadian who, in the article, state that he committed suicide by jumping off a steamer in the middle of Lake Superior. And the reason why I included it is because it gives us kind of a little bit of a picture of some of the people who are working at this camp. And so essentially the article says that he was part of a party that was going to be working out on the logging camps on the Duluth extension, which was the name of the Port Arthur, Duluth, and Western at the time. And so kind of gives us a little bit of an insight into some of the ethnicity of some of the people who were working at these camps at Gunflint Lake. And so again, more articles here. This is the end of October, and this is talking about the Steamer America, which made regular trips between Duluth and Port Arthur, Fort William, and basically talking about how it's bringing hay for the Gunflint operation, and towards the end of the month, sending out more men to the Gunflint camps. Now, one of the great things that we have for us is we actually have a very, very important geographical tool that gives us a lot of detail about the Pigeon River Lumber Company's operation at Gunflint Lake. So if you're not familiar with this, in 1908, the government of Canada and the government of the United States basically signed an agreement that they were going to basically go through and delineate the border between Canada and the United States. There was basically some rough maps that had been done, but it had never properly been surveyed. And again, if you're not familiar with this, there was an incident that happened a number of years before called the Alaska Boundary Dispute, where Canada and the United States argued about the exact location of the boundary in that area. And so following that incident, the two countries decided, well, maybe it's time that we actually figure out where the boundary is. And so what they did was they basically surveyed the whole boundary from Atlantic to Pacific. Now, the survey that was done for this particular area, you can see on the screen here. So this particular map, the area was surveyed in 1911. And so what that basically tells us is that this sort of represents a snapshot of what this area looked like basically 2 years after the logging finished at Gunflint Lake. Right, and so the map itself is very, very detailed. There's railway lines, there's roads, there's buildings that are marked on here, and so we see a ton of information on here as it was shortly after the logging stopped on Gunflint Lake. So if we actually zoom in on this map and take a look at kind of the eastern end of Gunflint Lake, we see a lot of really, really important information on here. Basically, we can see at the top part of the screen here, obviously the Ontario side of Gunflint Lake, and we can see at the time the abandoned Port Arthur, Duluth, and Western Railway running here along the north shore of Gunflint Lake. And then we can see right here, just before it gets to Gunflint Lake, we can actually see this rail line splitting off from that main line and then running down the eastern side of Gunflint Lake. And so this is the Gunflint and Lake Superior Railroad. We can see a few other pertinent things on this map here. We can see kind of in this corner here, I kind of lost my mouse now. This bottom corner, this bay down here, we can actually see a collection of buildings. That was the logging camp, the principal logging camp of the company, which I'm going to talk about very, very shortly. All right, so what's kind of interesting is the Pigeon River Lumber Company kind of built this railroad, and from what I could find was that they didn't really kind of ask permission to do this, right? It was just kind of like, we did it, sorry, right? We'll kind of apologize afterwards. But what's kind of, very typical of governments at the time, maybe the governments didn't give their explicit permission for this railroad to be constructed, but you can bet their money within a very short period of time, they made provisions to mark their territory. And so you can see in this article from the 12th of January 1903, right around the time that the railroad was finished and open for business, both governments opened customs houses on both sides of the border. And so this article is talking about a gentleman by the name of Thomas Roberts who left Port Arthur for, there's a typo here, it says LeBlanc, which is an incorrect spelling. of the customs boat. And so basically he was going to be the Canadian customs agent at this particular location. And if we sort of fast forward a little bit here, we actually see the official proclamation from the Canadian government. So this is coming from an order in council from the Governor General of Canada. And so basically it officially opens the outport of Leeblain. Now the name Leeblain actually came from a nearby village on the Port Arthur, Duluth, and Western Railway. I actually have a presentation on that I'll probably be doing in a few weeks. Depends what everybody wants to hear about. And so that became the official name of this outport. And so again, it was officially opened in July of 1903. Now, if we take a look at that international boundary map, it gives us a nice tight little perspective on that international crossing. And so what we can see here on the right side of the screen, we can see basically little Gunflint Lake and then little narrows that the border passes in between before it gets to Gunflint Lake. And then you can see here two buildings on the Ontario side, which are the only two buildings in the area, and I'm assuming that one of those is the Canadian Customs House. And then you can see a collection of buildings here on the U.S. side, on the Minnesota side, two right here beside the railroad grade, and then one up here on the top of this hill, kind of at an angle towards the other two buildings. Now, what's kind of interesting is we actually have a photograph of those customs buildings in Minnesota. And there's kind of a little bit of a neat story behind this. So I first saw this picture probably about 7 years ago. I was actually visiting the Gunflint Lodge, and I was chatting with Bruce and Sue Kerfoot, who owned the lodge at the time. And Sue had shown me this picture, and she talked about how this was something she called Merritt's Camp. And I said, geez, I'm looking at that picture, and I'm going, that looks remarkably a lot like, the buildings on the map, right? I can basically see a dock down here, okay, at the bottom of the picture. If I can get my mouse going here. I basically have a dock down here, and then I do see two buildings here, one bigger one smaller one, and I see this building up on the hill, kind of on an angle. And if I go back to that slide, wow, there it is, right? I mean, I see a little dock right on the waterway, and then I see these two buildings, two right beside the railroad grade and one up on the top of the hill. And so I kind of told Sue, I said, I got to get a copy of this picture, and kind of never got around to it. And then a few years after that, I happened to be on the internet, and I was looking through the website of the Cook County Historical Society in Grand Marais, and I come across this photograph. And so I happened to be going there to do some research. And so I mentioned to the director of the museum, Carrie Johnson, I said, would you be able to get me a copy of this picture? I'd really love a copy of this picture. And so I said, sure. She said, you know what? I'll actually get the negative of the picture. We have the negative. I'll get the negative, and that way we'll get a really good quality picture. And, she goes and grabs it, and she goes, she says, this is kind of a very interesting type of thing. She said, it's not really a picture. And I said, what do you mean? She goes, well, somebody's taken a picture of a book. And she said, this picture comes from a book. Somebody took their camera and took a picture of a book. And she said, you can actually make out the name of the book. And so I said to her, well, what's the name? And so she tells me the name, and she says the name of the book is called Hunting Wildlife with Camera and Flashlight. And so, when I'm done my research, I head back to Thunder Bay, and the first thing I do is I jump on my computer, and I go and look up this book, and sure enough, I find the picture. So the photographer is a guy by the name of George Chausse III, and very acclaimed nature photographer. And so he took this picture, again, doesn't have an exact date on there. I'm estimating around 1919, 1920, somewhere in that time frame that he took this picture. And so again, basically shows you the customs houses. The man that's in the photograph, I believe, is the old customs agent, Richard Dowman. And so he, even after the customs house closed, he spent a lot of years in that area, and basically the property was owned by the Merritt family of Marquette, Michigan, and basically he maintained it for them. And we know the picture was taken around that time frame because he left Gunflint Lake in 1922, so it had to be taken before 1922. I kind of threw this picture in there. If you're familiar with the area, I just love some of these old pictures and seeing those. And if you're familiar with the area, so the previous picture was actually on the Ontario. He's basically standing on the Ontario side looking south. And the next picture is almost like he sort of pans the camera to the east and takes a picture down Little Gunflint Lake. And, very remarkable picture. And it looks almost exactly like that today. Kind of a little statistics for you. We often think in modern days that, sort of our governments do kind of half-brained things and, they do things that sometimes don't make sense. So here's some statistics for you. So first of all, the Canadian government kept really meticulous records, and so was able to glean a lot of information from this. So basically we know who the customs agent was for all the years that it was open. So it was Thomas Roberts, up until 1907. Unfortunately, in 1907, Roberts falls ill and he eventually passes away. And then eventually he's replaced on a permanent basis by a man by the name of Peter Chausse. What you'll notice in this data here is you'll see that for all the years that the customs at Leeblain was open, the Canadian government paid $4,600 in wages, but at the same time only collecting just under $800 in duties. And so it's very interesting to see that they spent all of this money and did not get a very big return on their investment. Okay, so it was a very money losing type of venture. We actually have some records from that customs house. These two next sheets are actually located at the Thunder Bay Museum, and so essentially they're copies of train manifests. And so essentially what we can see on here, it's kind of hard to make out, but basically these sheets are dated from January of 1907, and essentially they have the contents of a train load, a cargo load of a train, and basically it has basically flat cars full of logs. At the bottom is the signature of the customs agent, Thomas Roberts. So his signature is down there, and then there's a second one as well. So it's kind of neat to actually see those records right from that spot. And so just some little information about things on the U.S. side. And so there's Richard Dowman, who originally was from Ireland, and he worked at Gunflint Lake. Now, I don't know how many days he was paid for, but basically he was paid a per diem. He was paid $3.50 per diem. Now, if you do the math on that, he was actually paid quite a bit of money if they actually paid him 365 days a year. So again, probably the United States government was losing even more money than the Canadian government was having an agent at that location. And so here's a photograph of Peter Chausse, who was the second Canadian customs agent. He took over in late 1907 from Thomas Roberts, and then the picture of Richard Dowman, again, who was the U.S. customs agent the entire period, and again stuck around at Gunflint Lake up until 1922. All right, so as I mentioned, we do want to talk a little bit about the logging camp of the Pigeon River Lumber Company. Again, I'll show you the picture, the map, and so here's a little snippet from Outing Magazine, and the article is dated April 1918. I believe the article was based on an expedition that was done the previous year. So it talks about at the eastern end of Gunflint Lake was one of the great logging camps of the Pigeon River Lumber Company, Camp 4. And so here's the close-up of the International Boundary Commission map. And so essentially what we can see here is we can see this line of 8 buildings here, sandwiched basically between the railroad grade and Gunflint Lake. And now we don't know if there's any authentic pictures of that logging camp. There might very well be, but sometimes a lot of these photographs were not labeled. And so here in Thunder Bay anyway, we actually have a recreation of a period logging camp. So this is at a place called Centennial Park, which was built during Canada's centenary in 1967. And so essentially we have a replica logging camp, one that was basically based on something you would have seen around 1910, so right in the period. And so your typical logging camp would have had 1 or possibly 2 bunkhouses. And again, you can see the construction with the interlocked logs. And on the inside, very, very crude. Again, very almost puritanical types of settings, right? You can just basically see these wooden bunks. The men would have stepped on hay bedding with some sheets on top. You can see the big stove in the middle to provide heat. Here's a wash basin or a trough where the men could sort of clean themselves. Obviously, every camp would have had a cookhouse. This would have probably been one of the most important buildings at any logging camp. And so basically the cookhouse would have been divided into two parts. There would have been one part where obviously all the cooking was done, and then another part where the men would have eaten. Okay, and you can see how they would have eaten, basically long sort of benches. And here's sort of a period photograph of men eating at one of these cookhouses. Again, you can see, you could almost imagine there's no windows in this particular building. You can see they all have kind of oil kerosene lamps. It would have had a very dark, kind of very sinister appearance inside. Okay, you can see how the men are kind of all crowded together. Obviously, given the current situation in the world today, there's lack of physical distancing in this particular cookhouse. Another structure that you would have seen at a logging camp was something, some people call it the office. The technical term for it was called the van. And basically that was the spot where the camp foreman would have been located, and probably his assistants. You can see that inside there would have been spots for basically people to do paperwork. So there was workbenches and desks. You can see it's a little bit more spacious inside. So there have been a little bit more kind of elbow room for the people in the van. Another important structure, the blacksmith. Basically, when you're talking about using axes and saws, and you have horses, and the horses need to be shoed. The blacksmith was very, very important. Again, all the tools of the trade. They would have been responsible for maintaining a lot of the equipment, repairing a lot of the equipment. If there was a logging railroad, they would have had to help the train crews do any repairs to the locomotives and the cars and things like that. Obviously, there would have been a stable for the multiple teams of horses, and I'll actually show you how many horses were actually present at Gunflint Lake at the time. And then obviously we need some facilities. And again, the outhouse would have been very, very crude. Again, not very, what's the word that I want to say? Not very comfortable type of environment, but, allowed people to do their business. And then again, at this spot, you can see some of the tools, the paraphernalia that they would have used. Okay, again, in an age before mechanization, so basically a lot of axes and saws that would have been used in these operations. So a lot of manual types of things were being done. Very, very important piece of equipment here. This was known as the sprinkler. A lot of the logging at the time was done in the winter, and a big part of that logging was to actually move the cut logs. And what they used to do is move them on roads that had been iced. And so this device was actually very important. This was a sprinkler. This basically allowed for the construction of those iced roads. And so essentially this thing was filled up with water, and basically it spread the water almost like a horse-driven Zamboni almost, right, to construct these types of roads. The Doyle scale was basically something was used at the time to basically calculate the amount of lumber that they'd be able to get out of the log. Basically, the loggers knew that the logs were cut to a certain length, and what they would do is they would measure the bottom diameter, so the big diameter of the log, and they would basically be able to calculate how much timber they would be able to get out of these logs. So if we turn our attention to Camp 4, sadly, there's no kind of remains of any of these structures or anything like that, but there are still lots of debris around the camp. I've been to Camp 4 on many occasions. My first trip there was in 1997. Sadly, some things have gone missing over time. People tend to sort of pick things up, but these are some of the things that I photographed back in 2015 that were kind of hanging around. You can see all types of things, lots of links from chain and things like that, chunks of metal. You can see here one almost looks like parts of a wrench. And this is scattered all over the place. The debris field around this camp is enormous. This is a piece of the actual rail here. It's actually a piece that's used in a switch. for a railway track. Again, all kinds of unidentified pieces of metal, braided cable, again, chain. This one here is kind of a little bit of an interesting find. It was just kind of sitting on the surface there. That I didn't quite know what it was, and then somebody pointed out to me, it's a bottle stopper, right? And so the cork has obviously deteriorated, and so that would have fit into the top part of a bottle. This was sent to me by one of the gentlemen that worked for the United States Forest Service, Tom Caffeine. This is something he found at the site in 2011. It was a snuff jar. And so obviously at the time, a lot of men liked their tobacco. And so this is how you can actually see at the bottom here, it actually says snuff on it. And so this is how the tobacco would have come to them. Okay, so moving ahead. Oops. The article's not popping up here, little glitch here. But again, one of the interesting things about this operation was they built this railroad, and a few months after they actually built it, it kind of dawned on them that hey, maybe we should actually get official permission to build this railroad. And I apologize, the article's not kind of popping up here. It's obviously glitching out a little bit, but they. One of the big problems they had was that they had the rights to cut the timber, but they didn't own the land, and so they decided to incorporate the railroad. And what it would do was basically allow them to cross people's property legally, right? And so that was the whole kind of purpose of that. Around the same time, we actually kind of get notification that we've got kind of something really interesting kind of underfoot here. So this is an article from a publication called The Paper Mill. This was August 1903, and in there it basically talks about all the timber tracts that are owned by the Pigeon River Lumber Company, and then it talks about in the second paragraph, it says, a strange condition of affairs exists at the mill, where logs cut in the States being manufactured into lumber in Canada. And again, kind of talking about that very kind of unique situation that was going on down here, where usually it's the opposite that happens, right? Where usually the raw material is cut in Canada and then processed in the United States. So we actually have the opposite situation happening. Now, I did mention that I would sort of talk a little bit about this. So the key to this whole logging operation at Gunflint was the fact that there was already a railway that ran down to the area. And so in order for this logging operation to work, the Pigeon River Lumber Company would actually have to work with the company that owned the railway, right? And it wasn't a particularly smooth. It was a very rocky kind of relationship. So I'm just going to give you a quick little history of this. So I mentioned already the railway that was built down to that area was known as the Port Arthur, Duluth, and Western. Its history dated well back to the time frame that we're talking about. The idea of building a railway from the city of Port Arthur to Duluth had been kind of kicking around for a while. They had tried to build one back in 1881, and that didn't work. And then they got another idea started up in 1883, and that didn't kind of work. And in 1887, they changed the name of it, and that's where the name Port Arthur, Duluth, and Western came around. And so finally, it wasn't until 1889 that they actually started construction. And it took them 2.5 years to build this railway from Port Arthur to the end of Gunflint Lake. And then they built another 6 miles into Minnesota. And the whole sort of gist of building this was that obviously in the northern part of Minnesota and in the southern part of this area, there's a lot of iron. And so there was an iron development that was being opened up just across the border in Minnesota, known as the Paulson Mine. And so the railway was constructed to that mine with the intention of bringing the iron out of the mine. Now, unfortunately, in 1893, right when the railway was finished, right when this is all going to happen, a world depression hit, okay? And it was called the Panic of 1893. And unfortunately, it basically bankrupted the company, the number of companies that were running the Paulson mine. And so that whole end kind of fell apart. And so now you had this railway that had been built all the way from Port Arthur to Gunflint Lake, but didn't connect to anything, and had no means of generating any money. And so the whole idea was that they were going to use the money from the mine to pay for the remaining 40 miles that they had to build from Gunflint Lake to Ely, Minnesota, to link up with the Duluth and Iron Range Railroad and give them a link to Duluth. Well, they didn't have the money, so that link never got built. And so, unfortunately, the Port Arthur, Duluth, and Western, or as people began calling it, the PD Railway, kind of staggered on for a bunch of years and just lost money, and a lot of the infrastructure began to deteriorate, and the people that owned the company, which were a lot of investors out of the city of Toronto, they started looking to unload this railway, and they couldn't find any buyers. And that was until the late 1890s. And what ended up happening was the railway was bankrupt at the time when it was bought by two individuals named Mackenzie and Mann. Now, William Mackenzie and Donald Mann eventually went on to create a company known as Canadian Northern Railway. And it took them a bit of time, but eventually they built a second transcontinental railway across Canada. And the PD was going to be part of that link. And so by the time that we're talking about, the time frame that we're talking about, when the Pigeon River Lumber Company was logging at Gunflint Lake, the PD name had actually disappeared. Canadian Northern Railway had renamed the railway. They called it the Duluth Extension of the Canadian Northern Railway. And you can see a time card here. So this is basically 1901, the year before logging started at Gunflint. And so essentially, you can see the trains leaving Port Arthur and heading down to Gunflint Lake and returning the next day. Well, very quickly, Canadian Northern figured out that there was no business at the end of the line. There was basically no people living, very few people living at Gunflint Lake. And so what ends up happening is the next year they actually stop running trains to Gunflint Lake. They actually terminate at North Lake because there is a little bit of business going on there. That is until the Pigeon River Lumber Company comes on. And so later in 1902, they actually start running trains to Gunflint again, primarily to facilitate this logging operation. But that's it. And then after that, they stop running trains. And so the Pigeon River Lumber Company actually has to lease the railway from North Lake all the way to where the Gunflint and Lake Superior Railroad starts, right? So they're leasing 8 miles of line from Canadian Northern. Again, the relationship was very tumultuous, and the line itself was not particularly in good shape. It had not really been looked after in all that time. And this next article here, this is actually written by William Scott himself, and this was published in 1934. And the article talks a little bit about dealing with the PD Railway. And so it talks about how, in those early days, there was only one train to haul the logs, and there was no telegraph line. So the train would basically leave, and once it passed Stanley, which was at milepost 19, they had no communication with the trains. They had no idea what was going on until the train got back to Stanley. And sometimes it would be days before the train would get back. And then this was probably at the time when the railway earned its very ubiquitous nickname. There was a very famous author by the name of James Oliver Curwood, who wrote some very, very famous novels, and some of them were actually based on the area around the PD Railway. And he was the guy that actually gave it the nickname, the Poverty, Destruction, and Want, because of how poor condition the railway was in. And obviously, the Pigeon River Lumber Company was very concerned about this, right? I mean, they're trying to run these log trains over there, and the ties all need to be replaced, and the bridges need to be fixed, and there's no telegraph line. And so the guy that they brought their complaints to is this guy here. There's a lot of discussion, a lot of kind of nagging this guy by the name of E.A. James, who was the general manager of Canadian Northern Railway. A lot of correspondence going back and forth, kind of pestering this guy to get some work done and to upgrade the railway line. So finally, he relents. And so in the summer of 1903, Canadian Northern says, okay, fine, we will start, kind of upgrading the line and making improvements to it. And one of the big improvements that they do is they actually agree to install a telegraph line along the railway. And one of the interesting things that I was curious about was how far this telegraph line actually went. We knew that it went all the way to North Lake, but how far past that did it go? And so actually starting in the late 90s, I started trying to find some evidence of this. So you can see here from this picture in 1997, I actually located a number of telegraph poles. In this case, this one was along Little North Lake. And then I went back to the area a number of years later. So in 2012 and 2013, I actually located some of the wire, and in some cases complete with the insulator still attached to them, lying on the ground. And so that was kind of a neat little discovery. And then I kept kind of poking and prodding and trying to find more of this. And so this is a little bit further west. This is on Little Gunflint Lake. So I found pieces of telegraph line, and this is right where the railroad, the Gunflint Lake Superior, crossed in from Ontario into Minnesota, right on that little narrow strip of land between Little Gunflint and Gunflint Lake. And so this is a piece of telegraph line there. And then this is a little bit further. This is at Camp 4, and around this tree trunk is a strong, big coil of what appears to be, anyway, telegraph wire. And this is south of Camp 4, another pile of, might be a little bit hard to see in the picture here, but basically piles of wire all kind of coiled up alongside the railroad grade. Now, another big problem that they had was with regard to motive power. So they built this railroad, but they had no locomotives. They had no way of actually moving the logs. They had to depend on Canadian Northern, and Canadian Northern wasn't very cooperative. So eventually, the Pigeon River Lumber Company got fed up and decided that we are going to buy our own locomotives. They started with the first one, and so the first locomotive that they bought was in December of 1903. The locomotive that they bought, and this was very common at the time, a lot of these logging railroads did this, they bought used engines. So they purchased what's called a 440 locomotive, and that describes the wheel configuration of the locomotive. And that was purchased from the Chicago, St. Paul, Minneapolis, and Omaha Railroad. It had been built, that particular locomotive had been built somewhere around 1872 or 1873. So it was quite old. It was about a 30-year-old engine. And obviously it was used on the Gunflint Lake Superior for 6 years. And then, according to author J.P. Bertrand, it was eventually was working at a quarry in Port Arthur known as Hewitson's Quarry. And so, again, we do have some evidence to back all of this up, and so I'm going to talk a little bit more about this later on. So we do have the Arpin Papers, and so this is actually an excerpt from those company documents. And so basically the date there, so it's the 7th of December, 1903, and basically it's a letter from Arpin to the superintendent of the railway, and basically says, please find a check for $2,500 for this locomotive. Asks them to make sure that it's all in working order, and asks them to please have the initials G and LS RR painted on the side, and as well as the number 1 beside it. And so this locomotive finally shows up in Thunder Bay in Fort William, Port Arthur in December, the end of December 1903, and it's sent out on the line. The engineer was actually somebody from the hometown of Arpin and Scott, a guy by the name of Fred Pagum, and he was the first locomotive engineer. And so this is a photograph of this particular engine. And so it was taken, the photograph was taken in October of 1903, basically sitting in this company's rail yards, basically in storage. And so, again, you can see it's, obviously it's seen some work, looks a little weathered, okay, but in this case, very, very useful to the Gunflint and Lake Superior. Now, one of the other interesting little tidbits here is we actually have some documentation about the fuel that was used for this. Again, this comes right out of the Thunder Bay Museum. And so we actually have, they're kind of hard to see because they're photocopies of the original documents. And then I've taken a picture of those photocopies. But basically, these two documents are manifests from the Canadian Northern Railway. And they basically detail 2 shipments of coal. One is from the 27th of January, 1904. And you can see, again, might be hard to see on your screen here, but basically saying that this load of coal is headed for Gunflint, Minnesota, 22 tons of it being shipped in bond. And then there's a second manifest, and this one is dated the 16th of February, 1904, again, headed for Gunflint with 24 tons of coal. And this one you can actually make out the stamp on it. And so it says Canadian Customs, Leeblain, Ontario, February 19th, 1904, certified exported with unbroken custom steel and the signature of Thomas Roberts underneath. So kind of a little interesting piece of document that we have there. Now, unfortunately, that first winter was really, really rough for them. You can see in the article here that they actually had a lot of snow along the Duluth extension. They had a locomotive now, but they had no snow plow, so they had no way of plowing the snow. And so obviously that made it very, very difficult for them to haul their logs from Gunflint Lake to North Lake, where they would be hauled to Port Arthur by Canadian Northern. So certainly a big challenge. And then 2 years later, they bought a second locomotive, and this ties in with a little bit with the extension of the line. And so the second locomotive they bought was actually a specialty locomotive. It was known as a Chausse locomotive, and I'm not going to get into all the details about it, but basically Chausses were one of a small number of specialized logging locomotive types that were built. They were specifically designed to work on logging lines that were not particularly well built, that may have very sharp turns, that had very big inclines. And so this one was a 32-ton Class B Chausse. Was originally built in 1901 for the Alexander Edgar Lumber Company of Iron River, Wisconsin. Eventually, this locomotive, once it had done its time at Gunflint Lake, it was sold to the Holt Lumber Company out of Wisconsin, and eventually the Holt Lumber Company was actually had operations in northeastern Ontario, around the Parry Sound area, and so that locomotive actually ended up over there working. And so here's a photograph or a picture of a Chausse locomotive, very unusual. Again, I'm not going to get into kind of all the characteristics of these particular types of locomotives, but again, designed for working on these logging lines. Now, what I want to do is I want to direct your attention to down here. The way that the locomotive was driven by these sort of shafts and universal joints, and this particular one, this rear shaft is very important. And the reason why is it actually ties in with this story. So when I first visited the Gunflint Lake Superior Railroad in 1997, and when I was walking around the location of Camp Number 4, I happened to spot this chunk of metal lying on the beach. Well, I'm a history guy. I'm not really a train expert or a locomotive expert, and so I had no idea what this thing was. So of course I photographed it, and eventually ended up on one of my websites. And years later, I got an email from a gentleman that I know, a local train enthusiast by the name of Ron Fuchik. And Ron tells me in the email, he says, "Dave, that's not just a chunk of metal. That's actually a piece off of a Chausse locomotive." And I said, "Really?" So, and this was at around the time that I was doing this research project for this book. And so I don't know how I got onto the topic, but eventually I started kind of researching a little bit more about these Chausse locomotives. And so where I ended up on this website called ChausseLocomotives.com. And basically, this website is run by a group of individuals who try to basically chronicle and document every single Chausse locomotive. There was, I think, Chausse built like 2,700 locomotives or something like that. They try to chronicle all of the locomotives out there, where they ended up, try to find pictures of them. And so I basically sent them an email, and I said, "Hey, I'm doing this project. I'd love to get a picture of a Chausse locomotive." And so then they emailed me back with, "No, not here's a picture." It's like, "You know about a locomotive?" Like, "Where is this?" And so I explained it's at Gunflint Lake. And then they're like, "Well, we don't have a record of that locomotive. How do you know that there's a Chausse there?" And I said, "Well, I mean, author J.P. Bertrand mentions it in his book." And then I said, "Here's this shaft on the beach." And so all of a sudden now I've got their attention, and they're like, "Okay, you got to find out for us, right? You've got to get this information for us. What we need you to do is we actually need to measure that shaft." So they send me this diagram, they send me this picture and says, "All right, what we need you to do is we need to measure all four of these things down to a 16th of an inch, right? So you have to pull out your measuring tape and get these measurements for us, because the Lehman Locomotive Works that built these locomotives kept very detailed records. We can actually tell from the shaft what locomotive that it potentially could belong to." I said, "Okay, well, here we go." So some of you who live in the area might be familiar with this. So this was all done in the summer of 2014. Well, 2014 we actually had a lot of snow that year, and so that year the level of Gunflint Lake was very, very high, and so that Chausse, which used to be lying on the beach, was still on the beach, but now the beach was, under a few feet of water. So in order for me to take the measurements of this shaft, I actually had to haul this thing out of the water, and it probably weighs a few hundred pounds. So it was an ordeal just in itself getting this thing out of the water. And so I do all the measurements, I send in the information to these guys, and they come back to me and say, yeah, so that shaft probably belongs to this engine or this engine. And this engine was over here at the time, so it has to be 683. And I'm like, wow, that's pretty remarkable. You actually know it belongs to this. Yep, they're like, we're pretty positive, 683. And so a couple of weeks later, I happened to be again at the museum in Grand Marais, at the Cook County Museum, and I come across this document, and basically the letter is addressed to the Alexander Edgar Lumber Company. You can see the date, May 3rd, 1905, and basically it says, have your statement, also copy of bill of repairs of engine number 4. And engine number 4 is number 683. And so basically I had the confirmation that this, in fact, was this particular locomotive that they were talking about. It's remarkable how these guys actually were able to, just by measuring this one piece of machinery, actually able to tell exactly what locomotive it belonged to. This supposedly is a picture of the locomotive. We can't be 100% definitive on this. This picture came from the area around where this locomotive worked, around that Perry Sound area where it worked in the 1920s. The characteristics match the locomotive that worked for the Gunflint and Lake Superior Railroad, but we just don't have that, sort of definitive evidence. But it, in all likelihood, is, but we can't just say with any positivity that it is. Another piece of machinery that they had on the Gunflint Lake Superior Railroad was a McGiffert loader. Kind of a little bit of a kind of interesting story to this. The McGiffert loader was actually developed by a gentleman named McGiffert who lived in Duluth, Minnesota. And so he pioneered this piece of equipment. So basically it was a log loader. Might be kind of hard to tell in the photographs here, but essentially had a sort of a retractable set of reels that would roll on the rails, and then when it got into the spot where it wanted to, the wheels would retract, and these sort of claw-like devices would grip onto the tracks, and then you would sort of feed the log cars in from the back and feed them through, and as they would come through the front, you would basically load them full of logs. And so kind of a neat little piece of machinery that they utilized. Okay, and so the next part we want to talk a little bit about is just, I know I'm getting a little bit longer than I said I would, is extending the line itself. And so again, here's that 1911 Boundary Commission map. And again, you can see the rail line running down the east side of Gunflint Lake. As far as we know, it was originally built to around about Camp 4. That's as far as it went for the first couple of years. And then slowly they began extending it southward, as you can see here, kind of, towards the southern end of the lake. And if you're familiar with the area, then it kind of turns and it parallels a river known as the Crab River. And then it climbs. You can see there's actually a series of ridges here, and the river actually forms a waterfall known as Bridal Falls. Again, to the people in the area, will be familiar with that. And so we do have some articles about that. And so this one is from the Cook County Herald in 1904, July of 1904, talking about the extension of the line and basically talking about how they're going to build the line from Gunflint Lake all the way down to Lake Superior. It's either going to go to Grand Marais or Big Bay, which is just north of Grand Marais. And we think the motivation for that was they were, the company and Canadian Northern were arguing about freight rates, right? They basically thought that Canadian Northern was charging them like ridiculous amounts of money to ship all these goods. And so they said, you know what, we'll just build it down to Lake Superior. We'll just haul the logs down there, dump them in the lake, and then boom them all the way to our mill in Port Arthur. That way we won't have to deal with Canadian Northern. We won't have to deal with the PD Railway. And so I think that was the mindset there. And so here's an article from the next year, from 1905, and this article actually talks a little bit about the company buying rails from the Illinois Steel Company. Basically talks about how they've purchased 4 miles of 40-pound rails and that they're going to be able to use them on the line. And I'll actually show you that we actually have evidence that those rails were actually put into place in that area. Now, one of the big problems that we have with this particular railroad and with a lot of logging railroads is they were designed to be temporary, and sometimes it's very difficult to kind of know exactly where they were. One of the great tools that has been developed in the last number of years that have been used by historians and archaeologists is something called LIDAR. And if you've never heard of LIDAR, it's basically an acronym for light detection and ranging. And essentially what it is it's a laser image of the ground. And what utilizing the laser does is it basically penetrates any vegetation, any cover that's on the ground. And so what it does is it basically gives you a three-dimensional view of the ground. And so it basically cuts away like stuff you wouldn't see on an aerial photograph, you see on LIDAR. And so this is an image actually of the east end of Gunflint Lake. So what we can see on here is you can actually see the grade of the Port Arthur, Duluth, and Western right here. So you can actually see how it's cut in places or embankments have been built. And you can see the Gunflint Lake Superior coming down, crossing the border, then curving around this bay here, and then making its way down. And this is just south of Camp 4 here, kind of hugging along the south side of this ridge, and then turning as it climbs the ridge here. And so you can see this big embankment here, and then you can see that they've done some cutting here on the top of the ridge. And again, you'll see some pictures of that later on. Now, the problem is once we get to that spot, we have no maps. This is really the only other map that we have, and this was a map that was done of Cook County in this one's 1926. There was a 1917 version. They're basically identical. So I believe that the information was gathered in 1917. So you can actually see the route of the Gunflint and Lake Superior here. It's just the problem is it's very inaccurate. It's basically slapped down. You can see the grade is running here along the east side of Gunflint Lake, turning south to Crab Lake, and then kind of going east for a bit. Again, extremely inaccurate. And so that's all we really had to work with. And I'll show you some pictures later on the grade. So it was very difficult for me to kind of figure out exactly how far this logging railroad went. Again, once you get past those ridges at the south end of the lake, the grade itself is not very pronounced. Now, one of the things that started to happen as they started pushing the railroad grade further and further south was they were getting further and further away from camp number 4. And so the rule of thumb, and this comes from text of the time, was that once you reach a certain distance away from a camp, it doesn't make sense anymore to basically shuttle the workers back and forth every day. You're better off building another camp. And so this was the case here at Gunflint Lake for the Gunflint Lake Superior. And so this is an article that appeared in the Duluth Herald. Was actually a reprint from the Cook County Herald. And basically it talks about in here that there's been a crew of men who are working for some time building new camps for the railroad. And it says there's about 200 men that are about to get to work and expand the logging in the area. And so we fast forward a few months to January of 1928. Again, kind of a little bit difficult to see on these kind of duplicated records here. Okay, but you can actually see when it lists all of the activity at all the camps. There's Camp 4, and all of a sudden this Camp 8 shows up, and they're all kind of lumped together. Right, Camp 4 and Camp 8. All of their data is all put into one. So there's our proof of the second camp. Now, one of the things that I wanted to do was actually find out that if this camp actually existed. And so what I did was starting in 2016, I started actually going out and trying to find this camp. And as typically happens, I couldn't find it. There's no real documentation. There's no maps that show where it is. I had a couple spots in mind, kind of looked around, couldn't find it, and then of course as things usually happen, I found it by accident. Now, please don't ask me where it's located, because I won't tell you. I won't give out its location. Basically, myself and the U.S. Forest Service want to keep the location a secret, because there is a lot of information that we can glean from it. And I'll talk a little bit more about this in a little bit. But these are some photographs that I took over some of my visits to this camp. And so you can see some of the leftover materials. These are pieces of pipe and rail. These are insulators, ceramic insulators for some sort of telegraph or telephone line that was strung. Find bits of coal and slag, a snuff jar, bottles and axes. This is a piece of a lantern, braided wire and barrel hoops. Now, one of the great things about this is some of the foundations of the buildings are extremely well preserved. And so this is the berm, I believe the western berm, of one of the best sort of preserved structures. This, I believe, my opinion, is the bunkhouse. And so we're kind of this is the western side of it. We're looking kind of north. And then this would be the northeast corner of this structure. And so you can basically see the remains of the stacked logs on top of the berm. And this is taken inside the structure, looking to the northeast corner. And again, you can see the berm line and you can see the stacked logs. And this is a close-up of that northeast corner. Okay, so very remarkable preservation. We're talking about something that was constructed more than 110 years ago. So it's amazing to see this. You find pieces of sawn lumber, all kinds of metal objects, cans, pieces of stoves. Here's another burn line of one of the structures. This one here is kind of interesting. We believe that this one is the outhouse. This is the latrine. Kind of hard to see, but basically there's a big depressed area, and this is kind of part of the berm here. And so we think that this is the facilities. Again, all kinds of objects lying around, horseshoes and axe blades and metal. Here's another piece of documentation. So this one's from February of 1907. Just gives you kind of a little bit of an idea of what was being done at the camp. So on February the 10th, 1907, camp number 4 had 15 teams of horses and 80 men at camp, and camp number 8 had 14 teams of horses and 96 men at camp. And so basically we had almost 180 men and almost 30 teams of horses at work at Gunflint Lake. Now, during the process of all this, a very significant thing happens with the Pigeon River Lumber Company. One of the original incorporators, Herman Finger, he actually leaves the company. And he decides that he is going to move on. Again, there's kind of a bit of a background story to this, why this all kind of happens. But he decides to leave, eventually makes his way out to Western Canada, eventually ends up in Manitoba, and eventually helps found the city of the PA, which is in the northern part of Manitoba, actually becomes the first mayor of the PA in 1911. So kind of a sort of interesting story with him. And so he's replaced by 2 individuals. One of them is a guy by the name of Alexander Stewart, probably as powerful and affluent as Hixon. Lot of businesses, both in Wisconsin, in Minnesota, into the southern United States in logging. So very, very powerful man. And the other guy that fills the spot as well is another guy by the name of Walter Alexander. Stewart and Alexander are actually partners for a long period of time, including that Alexander Edgar Lumber Company in Iron River that the company both bought their logging locomotive from. Now, we're kind of getting towards the end of the presentation here, and so what I wanted to do is just talk a little bit about the impact of this logging operation to the Pigeon River Lumber Company and how important it was. Again, we have some really excellent sources of information. One of them is something I call the ARPN Papers. These are basically original documents from the Pigeon River Lumber Company. They are bound books that contain all of the carbon copies of outgoing correspondence from the company, and they span the years 1903 to 1908. And they were originally in the possession of a Duluth lawyer by the name of Lloyd Johnson. Now, Lloyd Johnson, there's a whole story with him too. Is the reason why he had them in his possession was Lloyd Johnson was actually owned or was the principal investor in the Pigeon River Lumber Company right up until his death in 2006. And so the company was still kind of kicking around in that time. So he had them in his possession, and when he passed away, they ended up at the Cook County Museum in Grand Marais, Minnesota. And so I was able to gain access to them. And so again, just amazing documentation of that. And then the other great source of information we had, and I had to make 2 trips to this city, we actually have something called the Hixon records. So Hixon actually kept very, very meticulous records, not only of his own outgoing correspondence, but all of his incoming correspondence. He also had records from some of the companies he was associated with. So here in this picture here, you can see the records of the Pigeon River Lumber Company. And then you can see basically this one here is his letter book. So this would have been outgoing correspondence. And so what I was able to do was actually use those to fill in some of the missing pieces with regard to the ARPN papers, because there's gaps in the ARPN paper. So I was able to use Hixon's records to fill in all the missing pieces as well. Hixon had a lot of the ledgers and a lot of the financial information from the company as well. And so this is some of the data that we can glean from it. Again, it's very difficult to read. I do apologize. And so, for example, this is one of the first records where we can see some data from Gunflint. So you can see September 1903, and you can see at Gunflint they cut about 67,000 logs, which amounted to about 2.7 million board feet of lumber. And so that was probably about almost 30% of all the lumber that was cut by the company that year. And then fast forward to 1904. This one's, again, a little bit challenging to read. And so camp number 4 at Gunflint, they cut over 111,000 pieces of logs, which was almost 5 million board feet. And then in 1905, camp number 4 cut 2.6 million board feet. 1905 was actually probably one of their lowest years in terms of the total cut of the entire company. And then from there, it actually starts to climb. So in 1906, you can see that they've cut 3.4 million board feet, and the company only cut just under 9 million. So very substantial portion of the company's cut. And then if we fast forward here, we actually in 1906 we actually have some data on the company, and actually talks a little bit about how much everything costs. So the Camp 4 in 1906 cost the company almost $44,000 to operate, but in terms of its actual profitability, it was actually one of their most profitable operations. For every 1,000 feet of lumber that they cut, it cost the company $10.53, which was the lowest of any one of their camps. Just a little advertisement from 1907 that you would have found in the newspapers for the Pigeon River Lumber Company, basically advertising the white pine that they cut, as well as producing things like lath and pine and cedar shingles. And so 1907 data, this was probably the company's best year in terms of their Gunflint output. And so, again, might be a little bit hard for you to see, but that year at Gunflint, between Camp 4 and Camp 8, they cut 4.6 million board feet of pine. And the company that year cut 8.7 million board feet. So they cut 53% of their logs. 53% of their output actually came from Gunflint Lake. Now, unfortunately, things began to kind of drop off from there. This is, again, a little bit hard to see. This is a record from 1909. We don't have the number of board feet, but basically you can see if we go back to that total. I don't think we have a log total for 1907, but in 1909, the log total was only about 70,000, 80,000 pieces. And so they kind of were much higher in years past, and you can see things are starting to decline for them. Now, unfortunately, by the time we get to 1909, a lot of the marketable timber is gone. This is actually a letter that was written by Hixon in December of 1908, where he's very, very upset about Gunflint. And he's basically talking about, you can see it's underlined there, we cannot afford to go after timber that is going to cost us any such price. So he's basically upset that the costs at Gunflint have escalated, and it's no longer economical, and it's costing too much money. And he's basically saying we need to shut down the operation. And now, not everybody was sort of agreeing with this. I know Scott wanted to buy some more timber there, but basically in this letter in March of 1909, ARPN's telling Hixon, well, we basically cleaned up most of the timber at Gunflint. We haven't quite got 4 million feet like we thought we would, but it's pretty close. And then you can kind of see some of the newspaper articles talking about all of the timber that's kind of flowing in from Gunflint. Okay, 1,000 cars already coming down. This is an article from April of 1909 talking about how the lumber camps are shutting down, but at Gunflint there's still 120 men, and they still have a lot of work they still have to do to clean things up. We don't know exactly when the logging at Gunflint stopped, but we do have this document, and so this is an order in council from the Governor General of Canada, basically closing the Customs House at Leeblain on the 27th of April 1909, and the Customs House would be shifted from Leeblain back to North Lake, and so essentially the logging had to be done by that point. Now, what's interesting is very fortuitous that the logging came to an end when it did, because something very dramatic happens. Now, one of the things that they didn't do was they didn't remove all of the rails. And so this is a letter that was written in February of 1909, basically Arpin telling Hixon that if we want to keep the right of way, we want to keep the rights for the line, we have to leave some of the rails in place. And he says, I don't really want to do this, but maybe somebody is going to want this in the future. Somebody is going to want to build a rail line, maybe down into Minnesota, so maybe we should leave the rails in place. Now, unfortunately, what happens, we have a chain of events that starts in late May of 1909. There's an article that appears in local papers. This is the Port Arthur News Chronicle. Basically, it says that forest fires are breaking out. And it kind of just leaves it there and doesn't really mention anything else about what really happens. And I find this very bizarre because something very dramatic happens, but it doesn't actually make the local papers, but it makes the news wires. And so this article actually shows up in a bunch of newspapers. And so this one is out of Des Moines, and it's dated the 5th of June, 1909. There's some errors in here. It's the article's written by the United Press. And so it states that Port Arthur is actually in Manitoba. And so the article states that forest fires are spreading in the Gunflint section near North Lake. One railway bridge has been destroyed, but so far no settlements have been reached. If you know a little bit about the geography of the area, and you know a little bit about the railway line through there, there's only one railway bridge on Gunflint Lake. And again, we go back to that international boundary map that was surveyed in 1911. And so when we take a look at this map, the only bridge on Gunflint Lake is located right here. So at the west end of Gunflint Lake, there is a big bay. The proper name of the bay is actually Goose Bay. I don't know about on the Minnesota side, but in the Ontario parts, we call it Trestle Bay because there was a 1,000-foot trestle that used to cross the bay. That is the only bridge. And so that bridge, it might be hard for you to see on your screen, but basically the map here shows that bridge gone, right? That bridge does not exist in this map in 1911. So the only other, it was there in 1909, when it was being used, the only fire that we know about was in that May-June fire. And so we believe that was the fire that destroyed this bridge. And so if you visit Trestle Bay today, we know there was a fire that destroyed the bridge because the rails are at the bottom of the bay. Might be hard for you to see, again, just for you to see on your screen, but if you go there when the lake is calm, and that's not very often, and you actually go there, you can actually see the rails sitting on the bottom, right? So the bridge was burned, the trestle was burned, and the rails fell to the bottom of the bay. And this was a really neat picture that was sent to me. This picture was taken in 2007. That year, the level of the lake was very, very low. And so you can actually see the remains of the piles from the trestle sitting just below the surface of the water. It's very creepy when you go in there. You see all these kind of massive piles sticking up out of the water. And you can actually, it almost looks like kind of like an underwater bridge or an underwater pathway of all these piles. And they were all kind of burned off right at waterline, right? And so we believe that it was a fire that destroyed it. So shortly thereafter, we see this ad appear in some of the logging publications. And so this was in the American Lumberman of August 1909, that the Pigeon River Lumber Company was selling their 35-ton Shea locomotive, their 4-wheel Baldwin locomotive, and their McGiffert loader And so essentially they've given up on logging at Gunflint. Obviously, with the trestle burned, there's no way that they're going to get back to their timber tracks. I just kind of threw this in here. These are the official statistics that reported to the U.S. government, organization called the Interstate Commerce Commission, and so this is the actual data that they published, and so it just basically gives you an idea of the length of the line. So basically, they claim the line was about 5 miles long. This number is kind of a misnomer. It says 6, but they claim 1 mile is not in the United States. The number is actually 6. From what I've traced out, there's actually about 6 miles of line. When were the rails removed? I probably have to guess somewhere around this 1916, because in all the way up to June of 1916, it basically says the line is not in operation, and then after June of 1916, it says the road was abandoned. And we know that some of the rails on the PD Railway were removed around that time, so we probably think that that some of the rails at Gunflint Lake were pulled up around that time. Okay, so we're almost done here. I do apologize. Again, this was supposed to go an hour, and I'm like at over an hour and a half now, but there's always a lot to talk about. So I just wanted to sort of show you some pictures of what the area looks like today, and some of the traces that are still kind of hanging around. And so this first picture goes back to 1994 when I first began sort of exploring parts of the PD Railway. And so this is a photograph that shows the junction between the two rail lines. So basically to the right here, the main line of the Port Arthur, Duluth, and Western, and then the Gunflint Lake Superior kind of branching off here in Ontario. And then it runs down. It's about 400 meters of line in Ontario. And again, this is what it looks like today. That area was hit by two big events in recent history. In 1999, there was a massive blowdown that hit the Boundary Waters area. It was almost a tornado-like storm that blew down millions of trees. And then in 2007, there was a fire that ripped through the area that consumed a lot of those now dead trees that were on the ground. And so this is the junction point, as it was 4 years ago. And so as you work your way down, you find spots like this where you can see piles of spikes that are obviously somebody gathered them together, or they were left behind like that. And then basically you can see the grade itself as it sort of moves its way down. Again, this used to be a lot more open. Back when I first traveled there in the 90s, it was a lot easier to work your way down it. There are some spots that are a little bit more open. I'm not an archaeologist. I'm not really authorized to kind of do any digging. This is kind of just a little sort of digging that I did back in 2016 at the site of the Canadian Customs House. I just kind of scraped away some of the leaves and some of the debris that was lying on the ground, and this was just kind of what was near the surface. And these are some of the things I pulled out. So obviously there was some structure there. You can see bits of glass and nails, and there's a rifle cartridge and bits of metal. Again, I'd love to get some archaeologists in there, but that's a challenge into itself. This is a kind of an interesting photograph. This was actually taken in 1930, and so this is that point where the railway would have crossed from Ontario, which is on the left side of the photograph, into Minnesota on the right. You can actually see some of the remnants of the bridge over here that would have crossed across. Again, you can see those American customs houses in the background. And so this is what the area looks like today. This was 1997, and then this was 2016. So obviously with the forest fire and the blowdown, things have changed quite significantly. And then, so this is a photograph taken from the Minnesota side looking back towards the Ontario side. Again, very narrow. You can, the waterway is very narrow. It's basically about knee depth water as you make your way across. And this is a shot of the site where the U.S. Customs facility used to be. The only thing that's left here is I don't think it's visible in this picture here. Right here at the bottom, there's a pile of rocks where the flagpole would have been, and that's all that's left. And then just some shots of the grade as you work your way south. Again, back in the 90s, this used to be used as a snowmobile trail, so it was a lot easier to traverse, a lot more that you could see. it's a lot more grown in today after the blowdown in the forest fire. You find traces like this. There's bits of rail and spikes. This is a rock cut, 97 before the blowdown and the fire. This is what it looks like today, so it's the exact same spot. And again, pieces of rail scattered along the way. This was kind of an interesting thing that I hadn't seen this before prior to 2015. This is a spot where you can actually see how they've built parts of the grade. Again, this was designed to be a temporary railway. They didn't want to put a lot of effort into it, so they made extensive use of corduroy logs. So any low spots, any soft spots, they would have basically stacked these logs on top of each other to basically build it up and do it without using rock or anything expensive. And so you can see some more examples of it here. And then as we continue to work our way south, you can see some cutting, and this is where the line would have crossed a small little creek here. And so again, you can see the corduroy logs underneath the grade. And so this is looking to the south. You can kind of making out some of those corduroy logs in the water. And then in the middle of the creek, here's the cribbing that was part of the bridge. And then this is part of the cribbing that's on the south side of the grade. And this is the south side kind of looking back towards the north. And this is at that site. This was a couple of years back. There's my youngest son, Noah. He's holding a brake wheel. That was kind of, the water was really low that year, and so it was kind of right beside the shore. And so again, moving our way south towards Camp 4. This was part of the grade back in 97. Again, very easy to walk along. This is 5 years ago. This is almost the same area. You can see that there's no more trail. It's very difficult to walk through. And so here we are kind of approaching camp number 4. Again, you can find traces, bits of rail. And so this is actually right at Camp 4. And so Camp 4 is actually just to the west of this picture, just off to the screen to the right side, where the buildings at Camp 4 would have been. And then again, pushing south from Camp 4. And then, as I said, we do have some spots where we actually see some pieces of rail that are still in place. And I hope this comes out. Hope you can hear this.
SEC, there's a plus sign, 6001, plus Illinois Steel Company, Union 92 IX, which is the month of manufacture. So I'm guessing that's September.
All right, so there's those Illinois steel rail that we talked about. Still, there's a couple sections still in place in one spot. And then as we work our way a little bit further down the line, we get to another spot where we actually have a bunch of them in place, and we actually can see that there is, this spot was actually a siding, because we actually have a junction here. And so we can actually see the start of the junction. We see the double set of rails here. So kind of a neat little discovery there. And then here you can actually see the grade starts to climb as we try to get up that ridge. And so this is probably one of the more interesting things that you're going to see on this railroad. Unfortunately, this piece of engineering is gone. This was something that was known as the corduroy trestle. I first read about this back in 1994. Justine Kerfoot, who some of you may know who she is. She was basically a legend on Gunflint Lake. First came to the area in the 1920s and wrote extensively about the history of the area and the people of the area and what it was like to live out there. I remember reading her accounts of this, and then in 1997 I actually went and saw this. So what they had to do is they had to basically climb this big ridge, and they had a valley that they had to go through. And of course, they don't want to build an expensive structure. So this is what they build. So I'm standing on the grade. I'm looking to the south. You can see it climbing. This is what it looks like from the side. So what they did to fill this valley in, to make the grade, is they basically just stacked logs. Log after log after log, all stacked on top of each other. And then once they got the requisite angle, they put gravel on the top. It was just an amazing, amazing structure to see. I have this video is actually on my YouTube channel, which you're going to be able to see after, and I'm just going to play you a little portion of it. Again, if you want to see the whole thing, you can just go on the YouTube channel and take a look at it. So I'm just going to play it for you. So this is the video I shot on that 1997 visit, and I'm very glad that I did it because, as far as I know, it's the only video that we have of that structure.
Standing here below the railroad grade, the Gunflint Lake Superior, and to see what they did to span this chasm is just incredible. They stacked log after log after log and topped it all with gravel. It is just amazing to see this. To make a bridge, to make an embankment in this fashion, wowee. You can see there's the top. This must have been just some huge effort. But it's not just the effort, it's the size of this thing too. Like, it's not a small embankment by any means. It's literally huge. Maybe we'll try pacing out the distance after, but for now, I'm just in awe. Because the top of the embankment's up there, and I'm standing down here.
Okay, we're kind of pressed for time, so I don't want to go through any more of that. But again, you can see that on my YouTube channel. You can search for it. You can just type in corduroy trestle, and it'll come up in the search. Again, it was an amazing structure to see, and again, unfortunately, it's gone. And so, during that 2007 fire, it was one of the last areas to be burned in the fire. And unfortunately, the fire got into those logs, and the problem was it just continued to smolder and smolder and smolder. And the Forest Service thought that the snow in the winter would put it out, and unfortunately, it smoldered all throughout the winter. And sadly, in the springtime, they had to make the decision that they would have to essentially dynamite the trestle to basically expose those smoldering logs so they could put out the fire. And so basically they had to dynamite the middle section of the trestle and blow it up. Again, basically that was the end of the trestle itself. I mean, part of the structure is still there. You can't really see the logs. Obviously, the gravel has sort of obscured all the logs, and the basic structure of it is still there. But obviously, it's not the same as it used to be, right? And there's sort of kind of real big chunks missing out of it. I certainly, if I know for myself, I'm very glad that I had an opportunity to see it before it disappeared, and fortunate to see that shoot that video that I did. And so this is a view from the top looking down. Again, very, very steep, and you watch that video and you'll get a sense of that. This is kind of going up the hill, and so to lessen the grade, they actually did some rock work. They actually blasted out the top of the ridge. So this is right adjacent to the Crab River, to Bridal Falls. The rock cut and the trestle itself, the grade is almost 14%, so it's extremely steep grade. I can't imagine those trains kind of going up and down that hill. It just must have been an unreal experience, to pull those laden cars down the hill. And so once you get to the top of the hill, the ridges get, they disappear, and everything kind of flattens out a little bit. Now, again, this was one of the big issues that we had, was actually what did the railway grade kind of look like from here, and where did it go? And the problem is it's not very well defined. And so what I decided to do was to try to locate some of the traces of the railway to find where it went. And so the first thing I had to do is actually I had to ask permission from the U.S. Forest Service to use a metal detector, because you're not allowed to detect in Superior National Forest. So I basically had to ask and say, can I do this? And they said yes, just you can't take anything and you can't really dig. And so all I was allowed to do was just kind of find, locate the things and maybe kind of scrape away a little of the vegetation on the top and just make sure I knew what I was sort of looking at. It wasn't some piece of rock with a lot of iron in it. And so as you kind of make your way along the grade, you still find evidence of this. You find, the bits of the corduroy logs and spikes. And again, like I said, you look at it and you don't really see anything that looks like a railway grade passing through the area. You can only see the spikes and things like that, and some of the discarded pieces of metal, the pieces of track connectors, the fish plates. You can see in some spots they did a little bit of cutting work, and another fish plate. And then here you can find some more corduroy logs. And again, just finding those spikes. And this spot here, a little bit of rock work. Okay, you can see they had to sort of do a little bit of blasting to get the grade through there. And again, you're just sort of finding, remnants. It's a very difficult area to move through because of the blowdown, because of the forest fire. There's still a lot of deadfall on the ground, so it's very difficult to move around. It's not something I would advise doing. I know certainly I wouldn't go back to some of the places I went through. Again, you find spikes and find bits of coal. Again, pieces of connector. Right, and again, you look at where it's going through, and you have no idea that a railroad once passed through there. And then you do find pieces of other things. So this is what appears to be more wire, and again more connectors. More wire, and some places, there's a few times I thought I was going to get lost, that I had no idea where I was. If I didn't have a GPS, I probably would have been in big trouble. And so basically this is where it sort of comes to an end. So after 6 miles, it kind of peters out, and that's the end of it. So we're kind of, I do apologize, I said an hour, and well, here we are at 2 hours. Basically where we're at with things, so as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, I'm in the process of actually writing a book on this topic. Like I said, it was supposed to start out as an article, and it sort of exploded into a book. The book itself is mostly done. I essentially have 2 things left to do. The first thing, as you can see in this picture here, is there's some archaeological work to do. I was very fortunate in 2015 to be invited to be part of a little bit of a dig that was organized by the United States Forest Service at Camp 4. Unfortunately, we didn't have a lot of time on the ground, but we were able to look at a sort of a few things. And so since I've discovered Camp 8, I've been kind of pestering the archaeologist at the U.S. Forest Service to actually go there with me and do some exploratory work, because obviously they are trained archaeologists and they have the authority to look and examine and dig. And so obviously they're busy and they have other projects they're working on. So finally last fall, they said that they would start taking a look, and so we had planned to do some work in early October, and unfortunately the weekend we were supposed to do some work, it snowed. We got about a foot of snow up the Gunflint Trail, and so basically buried everything in snow, and so we were not able to do any work, and so we were scheduled for this spring. And so the plan was to go and do our exploration in May. Unfortunately, as you are very well aware with the whole COVID-19 situation, the border is closed and closed for the foreseeable future. So I can't imagine that I will be traveling down to Gunflint Lake anytime soon. I'm hoping if things begin to improve, that maybe in the summer, maybe in July, we'll be able to head down there. If not, we're going to have to wait till fall. So I'm waiting for that archaeological exploration to finish a portion of the book. The other thing I have left to do, I have to travel to Toronto to look at some things at the Archives of Ontario. Now again, with the current situation, I'm supposed to be there in July. It's all going to depend on how things kind of play out. So I may or may not get there. And so I was hoping to finish up writing the book next winter, but that might be delayed. So we'll have to see what happens. All right, so we're kind of at the end of the presentation. Last couple things I want to leave you with. Obviously, I've shown you some pictures. I've shown you some, some places. One of the big things I want to stress to you, and I'm sure my friends at the United States Forest Service will echo this, and certainly folks on this side of the border as well. There's been a lot of information that I've been able to get from some of these archaeological sites. You've probably seen this saying before, take only photographs and leave only footprints. It's very important, folks, that you come across any of these archaeological sites that you just leave everything where it is. I know there's so much stuff that I wouldn't be able to have if some of these things were removed, and I'm sure there's things that I don't know about because objects were taken. So if you do come across any of this stuff, please leave it behind. And the last thing that I'll leave you with here is basically some contact information. And so I do have a lot of stuff up on the internet. I do have a website where I do have information. There is information about the Pigeon River Lumber Company, about the Gunflint Lake Superior Railroad. There is a blog that I do write periodically that I kind of talk a little bit about what I'm up to. I'm on Facebook, I'm on Twitter, I'm on Instagram. I do obviously have a YouTube channel that you guys have been watching. And there's all kinds of videos. There's actually playlists of videos on the Gunflint Lake Superior Railroad that you can take a look at. Some from some of these explorations that I've done. You can obviously get a hold of me in many different ways. You can see my email address is on there. So certainly if you have any questions or things that you would like me to get in touch with you with regard, please don't hesitate to email me. Now, one of the things that I've done is in the comments section of this video is I do plan on doing more of these presentations in the future, and I've sort of laid out some options for you. And so if you're interested, please leave a comment or email me in what you would like to see in future presentations. So I'm thinking about doing one in a couple of weeks. So today's the 7th, so probably the 21st of April. We'll have another online presentation like this. And so again, just let me know what you might be interested in learning about or hearing about. I've got some options on the screen there. The PD Railway, the Paulson Mine, the ghost town of Leeblain. So let me know what you think, and we'll set something up for the 21st. All right, so again, I do apologize for running well over time. Again, there's so much to talk about, and there's so much to say that sometimes I get a little carried away. I thank you for tuning in this evening, and I thank you for taking in the presentation. And again, if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to get in touch with me. And again, hopefully we'll see you all back in a couple of weeks when we do another one of these presentations. So have a good evening, and please stay safe in this current difficult time. Good night.